This is a story about the silence of the woods, a silence so complete it can swallow a scream whole. In the nascent days of America, when Vermont was a raw and unforgiving frontier, a silence fell over a small cabin that would never be broken. In the year 1809, two sisters, Elara and Lillian Crowley, disappeared from their home in Northfield. They were not lost to a fire or a flood. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle. They simply vanished into the brutal cold of a Vermont winter. For over 2 centuries, their story has been a footnote in local history, a cautionary tale about the dangers of the wilderness. But what if the wilderness wasn't a monster? What if the real danger was a secret, a curse that followed a family to the farthest reaches of civilization, and a father's faith twisted into an act of unimaginable horror? This is the untold story of the Crowley Sisters. Before we delve into the shadows of this chilling case, take a moment to subscribe to the Crime O'Clock and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss a single chapter of this series. And I want to hear from you. In the comments below, share a local legend or historical mystery from your own area that has always fascinated you. Now, let's go back to a place where the snow holds more secrets than the ground. The year is 1809. Vermont has been a state for less than 20 years, a young and isolated frontier carved from a land of dense forests and rolling hills. In summer, it was a place of breathtaking beauty. In winter, it was a place of punishing solitude. The cold was a living presence, a relentless enemy that crept through the cracks in the walls and settled in the very marrow of your bones. In Northfield, a town barely more than a handful of scattered homesteads, the Crowley family arrived, seeking not a new beginning, but an end to a relentless chase. The patriarch, Elias Crowley, was a man of unyielding faith and a grim disposition. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of labor, but his soul was burdened with a terror that no amount of work could assuage. Elias saw the world in stark terms of good and evil, and he believed they had been running from the latter their entire lives. He had brought his family to this isolated corner of the world, convinced that the deep woods and the harsh climate would finally provide a sanctuary from the curse that he believed had followed them from their previous life. His faith, once a source of comfort, had become a shield of fanaticism, a wall built to keep the darkness out. His wife, Abigail, was a woman worn down by years of fear. Her face, etched with worry lines, was a window into a soul perpetually on edge. While Elias found solace in his prayers, Abigail found none. She was haunted by memories of their past, a past that had driven them from their home in Massachusetts, and she saw every strange sound, every creak in the floorboards, as a sign that the curse had not been left behind, but had simply found a new place to fester. She loved her daughters with a fierce, almost desperate intensity, clinging to them as a last bastion of warmth and light against the cold dread that filled her days. And then there were the sisters. Elara, at 16, was a free spirit trapped in a world of suffocating tradition. She was her father's daughter in her stubbornness, but her mother's in her quiet observation. Elara's mind was filled with stories and ideas that had no place in her father's rigid doctrine. She found her solace not in prayer, but in the natural world, sketching the patterns of frost on the window pane and the delicate shape of a bird's wing. Her spirit was a fire struggling to stay lit against the cold. Lillian, 14, was the fragile bridge between the two worlds. She adored her sister, her brave and brilliant older sibling, but she was also deeply attached to her mother and father. She saw the fear in her parents' eyes and internalized it, her quiet demeanor a reflection of the unspoken terror that filled their home. Lillian was more a follower than a leader, caught between her sister's yearning for freedom and her family's desperate need for control. In the silence of the Northfield homestead, a family was held captive not by walls of wood and stone, but by a fear that had followed them for hundreds of miles, a fear that was now settling in for the long, cold winter. And as the snow piled higher outside, so too did the family's dread. The Crowley family didn't simply arrive in Northfield, they fled. Their journey to this remote corner of Vermont wasn't a choice born of ambition, but a desperate flight from a past that Elias Crowley believed to be cursed. Before Vermont, they had lived in a small, pious community in rural Massachusetts. It was there that the curse had first taken root, a slow, insidious rot that began with a dispute over land. The land, a patch of infertile soil at the edge of the town, was believed by some of the more superstitious locals to be a place of unholy power, a nexus of ancient, pre-Christian spirits. Elias, in a fit of stubbornness and defiance of what he called pagan nonsense, bought the land and built his home on it. He dismissed the warnings and the strange occurrences that followed as the work of disgruntled neighbors or the devil himself. But the occurrences grew more and more unsettling. Their livestock would die in the night, their bodies marked with strange, unreadable symbols. Their well would run dry and fill with a brackish, foul-smelling liquid. The family home, a sturdy structure built with Elias's own hands, would creak and groan in the night, as if a great weight were being pressed down upon it. Elias's health began to fail, and his once unwavering faith began to crack under the strain. The final straw came when Abigail, tormented by nightmares and a deep sense of dread, confessed to Elias that she had been seeing shadows in the house, dark figures that moved just outside the corner of her vision. She also admitted that she had found one of her husband's own religious texts defaced, the holy words overwritten with a series of crude, geometric symbols, the very same symbols found on the dead animals. Elias, finally broken by the terrifying reality of his situation, understood that their home was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison. They left in the dead of night, leaving behind everything they owned, convinced that the curse was tied to the land itself. But they were wrong. The curse was not tied to the land. It was tied to the Crowleys. Elias, in his misguided faith, had not been fighting a physical enemy, but an ancient spiritual one. He had built his new home in Northfield on the northern edge of the town, far from the prying eyes of the new neighbors. But a family friend, a man named Samuel, had warned him before he left that the old gods of the land were not confined to Massachusetts. They are everywhere, Elias, Samuel had said, and they do not forget. Elias dismissed his words as a final attempt to frighten him, but Samuel's words would prove to be a terrifying prophecy. As the family settled into their new home in Northfield, the deep, dark secret of their past became a physical and emotional wall that separated them from the rest of the community. Elias, now even more paranoid than before, forbade his daughters from speaking to the neighbors and rarely allowed them to venture past the homestead. He built a new life for his family, but it was a life of isolation, fear, and silence. And in that silence, the old gods, the ones he had so foolishly defied, were watching. The curse had not been left behind. It had simply waited. In the grim silence of the Crowley homestead, Elara found her escape not in prayer, but in the stroke of a charcoal pencil. Her father's strict faith forbade frivolity, yet he could not curb the artistic spirit that bloomed in his eldest daughter. Her sketchbook, a small, worn volume she kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in her room, was a refuge from the crushing isolation and unspoken terror that filled her home. It was her private sanctuary, a world where she could truly see and understand the place her family now called home. She would spend hours sketching the natural world just beyond their window panes. She captured the delicate, crystalline patterns of frost on the glass, the stark beauty of a gnarled oak tree against a gray winter sky, and the intricate, spiraling patterns of a snowflake. But as the winter deepened and the family's dread intensified, Elara's art began to change. Her sketches, once a reflection of natural beauty, began to take on a darker, more unsettling tone. She started to draw not just what she saw, but what she felt. The deep woods surrounding the homestead, which had once appeared beautiful and serene, now seemed foreboding and full of hidden eyes. She drew the trees as twisted, skeletal figures, their branches reaching out like gnarled, beckoning fingers. Her drawings of the snow were no longer soft and gentle, but sharp and jagged, like broken glass. Then, recurring motif began to appear in her work, a symbol she could not place. It was a strange geometric design, a series of interwoven lines and circles that seemed to have no beginning or end. She drew it compulsively, a pattern she had never seen before but felt deep in her bones. It appeared in the patterns of frost on the window, in the knots of the wood grain in the floorboards, and in the swirling snow outside. Elara, in her artistic innocence, was unknowingly documenting the very curse that her father believed was hunting them. Her father, Elias, saw her preoccupation with art as a dangerous distraction, a vanity that drew her away from her spiritual duties. He would often reprimand her, telling her that the natural world was a veil for a darkness that sought to ensnare the innocent. But Elara, with the stubbornness she inherited from him, could not stop. She was a budding skeptic, her mind already beginning to question the rigid beliefs that had brought her family to this desolate place. She felt a connection to the land and the history of this place, a connection her father saw as an unholy influence. In her secret world of drawings, Elara was not just an artist. She was an investigator, chronicling a growing darkness that no one else dared to acknowledge. The whispers began in the snow, a slow, creeping sound that started as a prickle on the back of the neck and grew into a constant, gnawing anxiety. The first signs of the curse's resurgence were not a grand display, but a series of small, calculated terrors designed to break the family's resolve. Elias, ever the man of action, dismissed them as natural occurrences, but Abigail and the girls knew better. The world around their homestead was no longer just wild, it was watchful. One afternoon, Elias returned from setting traps to a sight that made him pause. The snow that had fallen just the night before was now crisscrossed with tracks, but they were unlike any animal he had ever seen. They were not paw prints, but long, narrow imprints that resembled a series of deep lines dragging across the snow, as if a large, heavy object had been pulled. The tracks circled the homestead, a chilling, deliberate perimeter, and ended abruptly at the edge of the woods, where there were no tracks leading back out. It was a silent, terrifying message. Inside the cabin, the dread was even more pervasive. Objects began to disappear, small, seemingly insignificant things that made no sense as theft. Abigail's silver thimble, an heirloom from her own mother, vanished. Lillian's favorite wooden bird, a toy she kept by her bed, disappeared without a trace. Elias, in his frustration, accused the children of misplacing them, but the fear in their eyes told him they were not lying. It was as if something was collecting from them, taking a piece of their lives each day. The sounds came at night, not the howl of a wolf or the cry of a fox, but something far more human. Abigail, lying awake in the dead of night, would hear it, a low, sibilant whisper that seemed to speak in a language she could not understand. It was always just outside the door, just at the edge of the window, a constant, taunting sound that was amplified by the insulating blanket of snow. She would pray, her rosary clutched in her hand, but the whispers would not cease. In her journal, Elara recorded these events not with words, but with a series of frantic, charcoal sketches. She drew the unsettling tracks, the empty space where the thimble once lay, and the haunted expression on her mother's face. She believed they were under siege, not by men, but by a presence that lived just beyond the edge of their perception, a presence that was slowly, patiently, and deliberately closing in on them. The silence of the Vermont winter was no longer peaceful. It was the sound of a family being stalked. While Elara found a way to process the encroaching dread through her art, her younger sister Lillian had no such outlet. She was a child caught in a terrible crossfire. Her love for her sister and her loyalty to her family. Lillian saw the way Elara's sketches, once a source of joy, were now becoming a grim chronicle of their terror. She would often sit beside her, watching as Elara's pencil moved across the page, forming the dark, unsettling shapes of a world she felt but could not see. Lillian longed to share her sister's brave spirit, but she was a child of her mother, a quiet, fearful soul who found no comfort in defiance. Lillian's fear was not an intellectual one. It was a physical, visceral sensation. The cold that crept into their cabin felt less like winter and more like a presence. The whispers that came at night seemed to be calling her name, a faint, sibilant sound that made her heart pound in her chest. She desperately wanted to talk about it, to seek some comfort, but the silence in their home was a rigid, unbreakable awe. She saw the haunted look in her father's eyes, the way his hands would tremble when he said his prayers, and she knew to be silent. One evening, unable to bear the weight of her fear, Lillian tried to talk to her mother. She found Abigail staring out the window, her breath fogging the glass, her face a mask of profound sorrow. "Mother," Lillian whispered, her voice barely audible, "are the spirits of the woods coming for us?" Abigail turned, her eyes wide with a terror that was not her own, but a terror she had inherited. She clutched Lillian's hands in a grip that was both tight and trembling. "You must not speak of such things, Lillian," she said, her voice a low, fierce whisper. "We must pray. We must pray and be silent." With that, she turned back to the window, leaving Lillian feeling more alone than ever, a child trapped in a prison of fear and faith. The fear in the Crowley homestead reached a fever pitch. Elias, a man of action, knew they could not stay, but he also knew they could not simply flee again. The curse, he now believed, was not tied to the land but to something he had done, a pact he had made, a truth he had tried to bury. He made a desperate decision. He would leave with Abigail to confront his past, to find the source of the curse, and break its hold over his family. He lied to the girls, telling them they were simply going on a supply run to a neighboring town. He told them they would be gone for a few days, and that Elara, as the eldest, was in charge. The lie was a thin one, and the girls knew it. The way their parents' eyes avoided theirs, the hurried, frantic way they packed their meager belongings, all spoke of a desperate, final act. Elias, in a moment of heartbreaking vulnerability, hugged his daughters goodbye, a rare display of affection that solidified their unspoken fear. "Be safe," he whispered to them, his voice thick with emotion, "and do not open the door to anyone." Just as they were about to leave, Elias found it, carved into the side of the wooden doorframe. A faint but unmistakable mark was the same strange symbol Elara had been drawing. The symbol was not a sign of a curse. It was a sign of a claim. It was an omen, a declaration that the spirits of the woods were no longer just watching. They were ready. The pact had been broken, and they were coming to collect their due. Elias and Abigail rode off into the deepening cold, leaving their two daughters in a cabin that was no longer a sanctuary, but a ticking clock. The sun was setting, and the silence of the Vermont wilderness was about to be broken by a sound more terrifying than a howl, the sound of a promise being kept. The homestead, now a fragile island in a sea of white, was filled with a silence more terrifying than any storm. Elara and Lillian were alone, the fire in the hearth, their only defense against the bitter cold and the growing dread. The wind outside howled, relentless, mournful sound that seemed to speak in 1,000 different voices. As the hours stretched on, the sisters huddled together, their small world shrinking to the confines of the log walls. Elara, ever the protector, held her sister tight, her eyes scanning the shadows that danced in the corners of the room. Lillian, her face pale with fear, clung to her sister, her every breath a shallow prayer. Then it came, not the wind, but a knock, a distinct, deliberate rapping on the front door. It was a sound so out of place in the vast, empty wilderness that it froze the girls in their tracks. It was not a hard, demanding knock, but a slow, measured series of raps, as if a visitor were politely announcing their presence. Elara, her heart pounding in her chest, motioned for Lillian to be silent. The knocking repeated, and this time it was followed by a chilling sound, a low, sibilant whisper that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once, a sound that seemed to be saying their names. The sisters remained motionless, their fear a palpable presence in the room. The knocking and the whispers ceased, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It was a silence that held a threat, a promise of a new kind of terror. Suddenly, a new sound came from above them, a scraping, rustling, a sound that could only be coming from the chimney. They watched in horror as a shower of soot and cold air came tumbling down the flue, a sign that something was trying to get in. The sun rose on the morning of May 17th, 1809, to a world blanketed in fresh snow. Elias and Abigail, returning from their desperate journey, saw the silence of their homestead from a distance. The chimney was cold, The windows were dark, and an unnatural stillness hung over the property. Their hearts pounding with a premonition of dread, they rushed to the cabin. The front door, to their horror, was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was a portrait of baffling absence. The fire was nothing more than cold embers. The beds were unmade, but there was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no blood. The girls' winter clothes were still hanging by the hearth, their boots by the door. The only sign of a disturbance was a window in the girls' room, slightly ajar, with a thin drift of snow on the floorboards below. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. Elias, a man of rigid faith, was a broken man. Abigail, consumed by grief, began to wail, a sound that echoed through the empty woods. The town was called, and a search party was formed. They scoured the woods, their lanterns casting long shadows against the snow, but they found nothing. The only clue was a single set of small footprints in the fresh snow, leading from the ajar window to the edge of the woods. But there were no footprints returning, and no other prints to suggest that someone else had been there. The cold, unforgiving landscape of Vermont had swallowed them whole. The official conclusion, an act of communal denial, was that the sisters had likely run away and succumbed to the cold. But Elias and Abigail knew the terrible truth. The curse had not been broken. It had been fulfilled. The case of the Crowley sisters lay buried for over a century. The official story, a convenient but hollow explanation, was all that remained. But the truth, as it so often does, refused to be silenced. In the late 1980s, a local historian named Evelyn Shaw, a woman with a passion for Vermont's untold stories, stumbled upon a curious detail in an old town record. It was a single, cryptic entry from the town clerk's logbook, dated 1810, that mentioned a pact with the old gods. The entry was attributed to Elias Crowley, and it was quickly dismissed and scribbled out. But for Evelyn, it was the loose thread she needed to begin unraveling a century-old lie. Evelyn's research led her to a distant, elderly descendant of the Crowley family who still lived in the region. The descendant, a woman named Margaret, had no knowledge of the sisters, but she did possess a small, worn box of family heirlooms. Inside, Evelyn found a brittle, leather-bound diary, the lost journal of Elara Crowley. The diary was a stunning revelation. It was a first-hand account of the family's growing terror, but it was also a document of Elara's skepticism. Her drawings, once dismissed as childish scribbles, now appeared as terrifyingly accurate depictions of the unholy symbol that was a constant presence in her family's life. Elara had not been a victim of fear. She had been a brave, young chronicler of a truth no one else would see. But the most damning piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Tucked into the back of the diary was a faded, handwritten letter. It was from Samuel, a family friend who had warned Elias about the curse. The letter, sent a year after the girl's disappearance, was a furious rebuke of Elias's actions. Samuel wrote that he had learned of the terrible truth, that Elias, in his desperation to save himself and his wife from the curse, had believed he could appease the old gods by offering them a sacrifice. The letter chillingly stated that the pact demanded two things, an act of betrayal and the gift of innocence. Evelyn Shaw, armed with the new evidence, finally pieced together the terrifying truth. The Crowley sisters had not run away, nor had they succumbed to the cold. They were sacrificed. Elias Crowley, a man whose faith was twisted by fear and paranoia, believed that the curse that haunted his family could only be broken by a blood offering to the very spirits he had spent his life defying. The pact Samuel had warned of was not a new one. It was an ancient, forgotten ritual that Elias had discovered in a desperate attempt to save himself and his wife. The whispers in the snow were not a random torment. They were the spirits of the woods, the old gods, reminding Elias of the price he had to pay for his freedom. On that fateful night, with the front door locked from the inside, the spirits entered through the chimney, their presence a terrifying culmination of a promise being kept. They took Elara and Lillian, not with violence, but with a terrifying, silent procession into the vast, snowy woods. The footprints Evelyn had so meticulously studied were not of runaways. They were of children being led to their doom, their father's cruel faith, their ultimate undoing. The untold story of the Crowley sisters is not a tale of a simple disappearance. It is a horrifying tale of faith corrupted and a father's love twisted into a horrific act of sacrifice. The untold story of the Crowley sisters is not a simple tale of a disappearance. It is a horrifying saga of a family destroyed, their innocence consumed by a father's warped faith. The cabin they once called home stands today, a silent monument to a forgotten tragedy. But the legacy of the Crowley family continues. The town's denial and the centuries of silence were merely a cover-up for a truth so dark, so unsettling, that it defied all logic and reason. The curse was never a lie. It was a terrifying reality, and Elias Crowley, in his desperate attempt to save himself and his wife, offered his own children as a sacrifice. The Crowley sisters did not vanish. They were led to their doom, their father's cruel pact, their ultimate undoing. This story is a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder that in the cold and unforgiving wilderness of the frontier, some things are far more terrifying than the simple ghost story. They are real, and their sacrifice haunts the silent hills of Vermont to this very day. And with that, we close the book on this dark chapter of history. But the crime o'clock never sleeps. Join us next week as we delve into another untold story, another chilling case that will keep you up at night. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next case. We'll be exploring the vanishing of the lost expedition from the Rockies in 1812, a story that, like the Crowleys, defies explanation. And tell me, what part of the Crowley sisters' story chilled you to the bone? Let me know in the comments below. Until then, stay safe and be aware of the shadows in your own history.